Thank you. Thank you, Roy. I'm not going to talk because I feel like I'll get sentimental. I'm just going to read from Watchfires. It's been such a really lovely and lucky day to be here and to get to go to two of Roy's classes and get to be part of Notre Dame for the day. Thank you all. I'm going to read a little from this memoir, and it begins kind of 2 years before the book that Zach read from begins. It begins in April 2013, and at that time, Zach, it's funny to talk about him in the book, I just call him the husband, but since he's here, he was getting first a cancer surgery, and it was the same day that on CNN they were playing The Hunt for the younger of the two Boston Marathon bombers. The marathon bombing had been a few days before, and so the book begins in that scene and extends from that to think about metaphors of terror and cancer and autoimmunity. And as the book goes on, I start to call the two brothers, Tamerlan Tsarnaev and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the man and the boy, because of the difference in their ages. And so you'll hear that in this passage. The passage also thinks about these kind of, this long illness in my 20s, which was long undiagnosed, and kind of what I was doing in that time. So I'll just read a little bit of it. The other thing I can say is that it's written in the third person. It's about a she instead of an I. Soon cries will commence to try the boy, a citizen, one of us, as an enemy combatant. Most who now bear that label are imprisoned without trial, offshore in that prison not legal enough for American soil. This spring, 100 prisoners are on hunger strike. To feed them twice a day, Navy medics force a tube down the noses and into the stomachs of the recalcitrant. Soon she will be buying cough drops for her husband, his throat raw from just such a tube, his nose bleeding. Every competent patient, the Code of Doctors states, has the right to refuse medical intervention, including life-sustaining interventions. What happened to the boy? What changed him? These were the questions the news poured over in ceaseless, stylized pronouncements from talking heads whose highlights and shoulder pads and soft-bellied suits streamed all day over the television surface. The metaphor was of a poison lurking among us, within us, in the body of our nation. Living like our neighbor, accepting our welfare checks, attending our schools, speaking our language, and then, without warning, attacking. A cancer, you might say. On the news, they agreed on a story. The younger brother had looked up to the older. The man had influenced the boy. The boy had assimilated, and the man had not. But what if the boy's adoration was the vital element? Without the love of the boy, the man was a failed boxer, a wife-beater, a thug. When he saw himself in his brother's eyes, his rage possessed new grandeur and new possibility. He formulated the plan not just for its own sake, but for the fact of his brother walking into the crowd 3 steps behind him, each sliding a backpack off his shoulders. There is no proof of this, but it is a story, and now only one brother remains. What can he tell us? If he had the choice, he might have preferred silence, preferred death. He must know that he did have that choice. It may help to say, for those of you who don't remember, that of the 2 brothers, the older one died in a shootout with the police, and the younger one is now in prison. 22 each day. Every 65 minutes, an American veteran takes his or her life. As a teenager, she'd suffered from anorexia nervosa, a compulsion towards self-starvation widespread among young women of her background and class. The disease is presently increasing among men and across the urbanizing world. 1/5 to 1/3 of sufferers will eventually die of the disease, the highest mortality rate of any mental disorder. The 2 illnesses she has suffered are existentially distinct. One was an emotional disorder or psychological, one is neurological. Those who treat them have little to do with each other. The first is a disease of the mind, or, speaking poetically, the heart. The second of the brain. In the case of the first, you may be held responsible as both agent and victim of your own destruction. In the case of the second, you are simply victim, passive, struck down. For the first few years, her anorexia had been misdiagnosed. She'd told family and doctors that she had an upset stomach, and this was why she'd lost weight, why she kept getting thinner. This was partly true, but mostly not. She was surprised when for years no one called her bluff. Her doctor, a gastroenterologist, had seemed accomplished. Recently, he'd been in the paper for his work in the cancer ward, photographed surrounded by tiny, bald children holding popsicles. After a colonoscopy, he concluded she had Crohn's disease, a chronic inflammatory condition in which the immune system mounts continual attacks on the normal beneficial bacteria in the gut. The summer she was 14, she was hospitalized. She stood 5 feet 5 inches and weighed 86 pounds. Throughout the 9th grade, she spent 12 hours a day on a feeding tube. At 6 p.m., she threaded the tube up her nose and down her throat, and until in time she became expert, checked its position in her stomach with a stethoscope. She dragged a pole hung with sacks of Ensure behind her through the house, and when the machine beeped in the night, she woke to pour in more cans of beige nutrition. At 6 a.m., she untaped the tube from her cheek and yanked it out of her nose, tasting each morning her stomach acid. She went to school. Only a handful of friends knew her secret, or perhaps everyone knew. At the rate the tube pumped calories into her, she would reach her target weight in 7 weeks, her doctor had said, and showed her the math on his notepad. It was not, of course, her target weight, but his. She only wanted the numbers on the scale to decrease and herself to diminish. He was proved wrong. It took at least 9 months for her to gain enough, and this was a triumph of her resistance. She followed the regimen she was prescribed, but did what she could do to sabotage it. In this way, her agency manifested itself through steadfast self-destruction. When she looks back on this time, the doctor's frustration as each visit she failed to measure up, to meet her mark on the scale, her silence as she sat in his office, feet dangling off the examination bed, she feels that they were both complicit. That although he stuck to his story, Crohn's disease, to be treated with steroids and enteral feeding, he knew that this was no more than a battle of wills. He did not want to admit defeat to a 90-pound girl, and so would not acknowledge her victories, that she wouldn't gain weight if she did not wish to, and that as soon, and this is what occurred, as she did, as soon as she returned the feeding tube to his office in celebration, she would lose all the weight again with extraordinary rapidity. Yet this is only a feeling. She has no way to know what he thought that drawn-out year. If he has thought of her since, she can't say of what she has become an example. She does know that she has never had Crohn's disease. Later, doctors looked at the same biopsies and shook their heads, clearly negative. They could not explain why their colleague had been so mistaken, and following a gentleman's code, did not quite criticize him. Even the Prophet Muhammad considered suicide. After receiving the first revelation, overcome with fear, he thought to throw himself from a mountaintop. From the heavens, the angel Gabriel cried out to stop him. Upon her recovery from anorexia, she wished to know how could so many go mad in precisely the same way. Her illness had felt so intimate. She had decided to diet, she dieted, she didn't stop. She had not endeavored to be anorexic. Had been years before she even owned up to that word. She'd chosen no model and acted quite alone, yet she'd fit precisely the common pattern. She read theorists who argued that anorexia arises as response to conflicts over women's role in society. Young women on the verge of maturation perceive the troubled path before them, to be a mother or to work, to do both and to fail, independent or dependent, virgin, mother, whore, object of anyone's desire or no one's. Seeing this storm of choices on the horizon, the anorexic tries to stop time. She sheds weight and her periods cease. She approaches androgyny. She halts herself on the threshold of fertility, of womanhood she will not enter. If women's realm is the home and the hearth its center, in refusing food and fertility, she will refuse the language of women of her own mother. Instead, silence unto death. Some claim that, like alcoholics, anorexics should only be called recovering, never recovered. She can't agree. To recover, most alcoholics stop drinking. They mark the days, months, years they've been clean. For the anorexic, there's no such purity. Every day, every few hours, she must choose again what to eat. She must choose to eat. There must be other theories of anorexia's origins and meaning, but her research ceased some 15 years ago. She considers the disease in the terms and metaphors she learned then. She won't begin again, try to see it anew, tell the story differently. But this isn't true. Sometimes she catches herself thinking of those years as a possession. She was possessed by some malign spirit of the age she lived in. When she with great effort exorcised it from herself, she felt as if, forgive the metaphor, she was awaking from a nightmare into the light. Was the disease herself, or was she diseased? Who was it who so endangered this body, terrorized her family 3 times a day, drove her mother into desperation, had so little mercy? She was sick. Did a demon possess her? It was she. Of the 171 men still imprisoned that spring in Guantanamo Bay, 89 have been cleared for release. But what should be done with them? Where will they go? It seems more than a decade has been required to answer these questions, though many answers would do. They remain imprisoned, no end in sight. 2 months into the hunger strike, 40 more military medics are shipped to the camp to help keep its prisoners alive, a task that now requires the use of force. A few years ago, 40 prisoners were released to be resettled in 16 countries. These are called third countries, the first being their home, the second, it seems, the United States. The U.S. imprisoned them, but they were never there. Some prisoners say the present strike was sparked by a shakedown in which guards mishandled prisoners' Qurans. Authorities deny this. They feel like they're living in graves, one lawyer noted on a recent visit. They won't let us live in peace, and they won't let us die in peace. The brothers might have learned strategy close to home. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, the U.S. has deployed drones to strike those who gathered to aid the victims of the strike before. It's not that each explanation requires metaphor, it's that each explanation is only metaphor. Metaphorically speaking, are we now in the age of autoimmune disease? Now the enemy is ourselves. We can no longer tell friend from foe, we mistake self for other. Helpless, we mount full-force attacks against ourselves. If the body could speak, could defend itself, would it name this a preemptive strike? Her husband will spend 10 days in the hospital, and she will be there every day. She'll read 3 novels, suck on hard candies, and walk through the fields surrounding the hospital complex. Each morning she'll bathe him. He'll stand in the bathroom, hunched with pain and attached to an IV pole, and she'll fill a basin with sudsy water and with a washcloth clean the bruised skin of his back and torso, the bruise that extends from his incision in every direction. In his morphined bluntness, he corrects her technique. Her intimacy with his body seems less than useful. The skill lies not in tending to one's husband, but in tending to any vulnerable body. Right before he's released, a surgeon comes by and, displeased with the discharge of a hematoma, plucks out 7 or 8 of the couple dozen stitches that bind the incision. You'll just have to pack these sites with gauze, he says, pointing to the holes he has created, bright red gashes. At home the next morning, they realize the nature of their task, to stuff a thumb's worth of gauze right into these chasms in the belly. She watches her husband's fingers disappear into his own torso and understands why people faint at such sights. What should be invisible made suddenly visible. Rupture, violation. Some doctors have diagnosed her with autoimmune disease, or rather, they gave her this name tentatively, a gesture to help her account for her body's failings. She never believed them. These stories did not feel true to her. Though her feelings were not meant to matter, these diagnoses not meant as faith claims. One doctor would name her illness channelopathy, disorder of the ion channels, and note that research had traced a handful of channelopathies to particular genetic mutations. It was posited that there must be many more such disorders, some of the mutations contained within single families. A family might possess its own disease. Of her flawed heritage, she might be the sole living incarnation. Consider her husband's case. If they hadn't known of his mutation, it would have been years before they looked for the cancer that was already there. Some diseases may be called diseases of Westernization. Eating disorders, Crohn's disease much more common in cities than rural areas in the global north than the global south. Colon cancer primarily afflicts those in the developed world. In the case of multiple sclerosis, also autoimmune, occurrence increases with distance from the equator. If one is born in a high-risk region and before reaching puberty moves to a low-risk region, one assumes the new lower risk of occurrence. But if one moves after puberty, one's risk remains high. For this phenomenon, there is no firm explanation. The boy was 8 when he came to the US. The man was 16. That's it. Thank you.